He vanished into the largest desert on Earth alone, with a broken truck, dwindling supplies, and no way home. For 522 days, he fought searing heat, starvation, and a silence so vast it nearly drove him mad. How did John Markson endure a year and a half lost in the Sahara, when almost no one else could survive a week? John Markson was a man who had always lived on the edges of the map. Born in Leeds, England, in 1968, he grew up with a restlessness that made him different from other boys. While his classmates dreamed of football or city life, John's eyes were fixed on the wide unknown mountains, oceans, deserts. After serving as a mechanic in the British Army, he had traveled across continents, seeking adventure not in tourist resorts, but in the unforgiving corners of the world. He hiked in the Scottish Highlands during winter storms, trekked in the jungles of Borneo, where every step was a fight against rot and disease, and crossed icy fields of Norway, where night seemed eternal. But nothing called to him more than the Sahara Desert, the great sea of sand that stretched across North Africa like an endless golden ocean. For John, the desert was both a mystery and a test. He was 42 years old when he decided it was finally time to answer that call. It was the spring of 2010 when he landed in Morocco with a simple plan and a stubborn determination. He purchased a used Toyota Land Cruiser, stocked it with fuel, water jerry cans, sacks of dried dates, rice, powdered milk, and tins of sardines. He carried maps, French colonial ones, faded at the edges alongside a handheld GPS unit, a compass, and his army knife. He wasn't reckless. He prepared as best he could. But the Sahara has a way of humbling even the most disciplined travelers. He told a friend in Marrakesh before he left, "I want to see what's left when it's just me and the sand. No shortcuts, no safety nets." That statement would prove prophetic in ways he could never imagine. His route took him east, following the ancient caravan trails that once carried salt and gold across Africa. Days bled into nights. The rhythm of the desert took hold of him. He drove for hours under skies so clear they seemed scraped clean, the horizon a perfect line of fire at dusk. He camped beneath blankets of stars, listening to the shifting whisper of sand dunes as if the desert itself were breathing. At first, the journey was everything he had hoped for: pure solitude, an untouched wilderness that tested his patience and rewarded him with beauty. He recorded his impressions in a leather journal, noting the way the sun carved shadows on the rocks, the way the wind sculpted dunes into towering waves. In one entry he wrote, "The Sahara isn't empty. It's alive, vast, and waiting to see if you deserve to be here." But on the 17th day, his luck cracked. He had been driving across a gravel plain south of Tamanrasset, Algeria, when the wind shifted with terrifying speed. What began as a whisper became a roar, and within minutes, a sandstorm engulfed everything. The air turned copper red, visibility dropped to nothing, and the wind lashed at his vehicle like a furious sea. Sand poured into every crevice, stinging his skin, searing his eyes. He stopped driving and waited, gripping the steering wheel as if it were an anchor. The storm lasted hours, and when it passed, the silence that followed was heavy and absolute. When he stepped out of the Land Cruiser, he realized his compass readings no longer made sense. The familiar landmarks had vanished under shifting dunes. Worse still, the engine had sucked in sand during the storm. He tried to start it, but the motor coughed and failed. Again and again, he turned the ignition, only to hear silence. The vehicle that had carried him across hundreds of miles of barren land was dead. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring into the emptiness around him. The desert had changed the rules. At first, he wasn't afraid. He had food and water. He built a small camp beside the vehicle, using a tarp as shade. He lit a fire at night, hoping a passing caravan or a distant traveler might see the flicker. He told himself that rescue was inevitable. After all, this was a modern world: satellites, border patrols, search parties, Surely someone would stumble across his path. In his journal he wrote, "Day 1 stranded. Keeping calm. The truck is home base. We'll wait." But the days ticked by without a sign of life. On the 4th day, he halved his water ration. On the 6th, he realized the tracks left by his tires had already been swallowed by the sand. No one would be able to follow them back to him. The desert was erasing him, grain by grain. He spent nights staring at the horizon, searching for light, and mornings scanning the sky for aircraft. Nothing. His thoughts began to circle in on themselves. Was this how people vanished here? Not in a blaze, but in silence, unnoticed, their bones eventually ground into dust? On the 10th day, with his supplies dwindling, John faced the choice every stranded traveler dreads. He could stay by the vehicle and wait, gambling that rescue might come weeks too late. Or he could leave and strike out on foot toward an oasis he remembered seeing on a map. He thought of his daughter back home, 12 years old, her letters tucked in his bag. He thought of her reading them after he was gone. The decision was clear. He would not let the desert claim him without a fight. He tore a sheet from his notebook and wrote in block letters, "Vehicle broken. Heading east to Oasis. Have supplies. John." He left it weighted under a stone on the passenger seat, then packed his rucksack, slung his water cans on a makeshift sled, and stepped into the horizon. That first night on foot, he wrote in his journal with a shaky hand, "The desert is not cruel. It is indifferent, but I am still here. I will not vanish." The first days of walking were punishing. He quickly learned that the desert punishes those who move under the midday sun. By 9 in the morning, heat waves shimmered off the dunes, making the horizon dance like a mirage. By noon, the air itself felt like fire pressing against his skin. He adjusted his strategy walk only in the hours before dawn and after sunset. Rest during the furnace of the day. He dug shallow hollows in the sand, covering himself with scraps of tarp, listening to the whistle of hot wind as if it were a predator circling. The Sahara was no longer vast beauty. It became an enemy with many faces. His boots filled with sand that tore at his skin. Blisters ballooned and burst, leaving raw flesh. His lips cracked until blood stained them. Each step became an act of defiance. He forced himself to count them in hundreds, rewarding himself with a sip of water when he reached the number. He stopped thinking in days. He started thinking in survival hours. On the 12th day of walking, his water was nearly gone. He stumbled across the skeleton of a Peugeot, abandoned long ago. The paint was gone, the frame half buried in dunes. Inside, bones told the story of another who had failed. But in the glove box was a miracle, a metal flask, sealed tight. He shook it and heard the slosh of water. It was rusty, metallic tasting, but it was life. He wrote in his journal, "I drink today because someone died here. Thank you, stranger." His food ran low, too. He began to study the desert not as scenery but as a menu. He snared lizards using loops of cord, roasted them on tiny fires of thorn branches. He cracked open beetles, grimacing as he swallowed their bitter moisture. He learned that locusts, though foul, gave enough protein to keep him moving. Hunger stripped him of hesitation. Survival left no room for pride. On the 23rd day, he spotted movement camel tracks pressed into the sand, leading away from the horizon. Hope surged through him. He followed them for 2 days, dragging his sled of supplies behind him, only to lose the tracks as the wind swept them away. That loss crushed him more than hunger or thirst. He collapsed in the sand and wept, shouting into the emptiness until his voice broke. For hours, he lay there, considering surrender. But as night fell, and the stars opened above him, he remembered the letters from his daughter. He imagined her face, waiting, wondering. That thought was enough. He rose, packed his bag, and kept walking. By the 6th week, he reached the edge of a rocky plateau. His ribs showed through his skin, and he had lost more than 30 pounds. But in the distance, Shimmering under the haze, he saw palm trees. An oasis. It was no mirage. He crawled the last kilometers, collapsed into the brackish pool, and drank until he vomited, then drank again. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't moving to escape death. He was moving to stay alive. He built a camp above the oasis, a crude shelter against the cliffside. He boiled water in a tin can, used plastic sheeting to fashion a solar still, and carved notches into the rock to mark days. He had shifted from traveler to prisoner, but he was alive. In his journal, his words grew shorter, but his meaning sharper. The desert does not want me, but I will not leave on its terms. The days began to blur into a single chord of heat, grit, and ritual. And John shaped his life to that chord because any note out of place might be the one that cost him everything. He learned the canyon's moods, the way a sailor reads a tide table, how the wind curled down in late morning, how shadows stretched from the cliff rim like fingers, reaching to touch him just after noon, how the frogs in the brackish pool clicked for a few minutes at dusk and then fell silent, as if a switch had been thrown. He anchored himself to those repetitions. Wake before first light. Check the snares he'd set in the thorn scrub, simple loops of cord propped with a twig, baited with something that might tempt a lizard or hare. Strip a palm frond and weave another strip into the sunscreen he'd been building over the rock recess he called the room. Mend the sandals he'd made by splitting the sidewalls of a tire carcass he'd scavenged from the edge of the oasis. Punching holes with his knife, lacing them with unraveled nylon cord. Count the notches on the cliff face, his calendar, the ledger that proved to him that time continued, and that he was inside it, not outside of it. He taught himself to drink like a desert fox, not when the throat begged, but when the body truly needed small sips, mouth rinsed and swallowed slowly to trick the brain into believing abundance. He found that if he dampened his scarf and draped it over his neck, the evaporative chill would steal a fraction of the noon fever from his skin. He learned to turn hunger into a task list. When the gnawing began, work. When it crescendoed, rest. When it faded, write. The journal became a life raft. He wrote to his daughter the way a lighthouse keeper trims a wick daily, careful, mechanical, because the light must not go out. I saw 3 swallows this morning, he'd write. Your hair looked like their wings when you ran in the garden after the first rain. Do you remember? I built a second still today. Used the clear plastic sheet, 2 stones, and a tin bowl. The drip takes hours, but it is clean enough. I will see you again. He wrote it even when he didn't feel it, because he had discovered that on certain days, words were the only water. The desert punished carelessness. He learned that lesson again in late spring when the Khamsin came, a hard, furnace wind out of the south that rose without warning, flattening the palm tops and sandblasting the cliff. It tore 2 panels from his sunscreen and drove grit through every seam of his shelter, filling his bowls, grinding between molars until his gums bled. He tried to hold the woven fronds in place, and the wind picked him up and slammed him against the rock like he weighed nothing at all. When it finally eased, he inventoried the damage like a mechanic after battle. The solar still had ripped. His stores were dusted with sand, so fine it felt like talc. His left forearm was full of pinprick cuts that looked small but burned like live wires. He wanted to rage, to plead with a sky that gave no answers. Instead, he lit a tiny cooking fire, with twigs he'd hidden in a hollow and boiled water to wash the wounds. Then he rebuilt. The desert wanted to see if he would, so he did. Sometimes he heard the world, distant but undeniable, the thump of rotor blades, a low growl that might have been a truck, the metallic cough of an engine in the far flats. He would climb to the highest shelf of the cliff and wave his scarf, burn a bundle of green palm fibers to make a dirty smoke that climbed in a wavering rope, polish the square of tin he'd cut from an oil drum until it shone and catch the sun with it. Twice, he watched a dot in the blue pass and vanish, and twice he felt the swing from flood to drought inside his chest. The first time, he spent the evening carving a new notch for the day, and then carved a second beside it, narrower, deeper, as if pushing the knife a fraction further into the rock might push himself a fraction further into existence. The second time, he wrote, "Today I saw proof that the world still moves. That is enough for now." Food was a negotiation with luck. Locusts came in a small silver swarm one dawn and rattled into the fronds like a brief rain. He waded through and caught them by the handful, twisted off heads, legs, wings, toasted the bodies with a pinch of salt from the mineral crust at the edge of the pool. He found a clutch of eggs in a sand scrape and rationed them like gold. Sometimes there was nothing. Then he would grind a few dates with the butt of his knife and mix the paste with a little water and pretend it was porridge. He chewed slowly, eyes closed, and tried to remember the taste of toast, butter melting through to the plate. "Memory is dangerous," he wrote after one particularly hard week. "It is also medicine." Illness announced itself in the smallest ways: an off rhythm to the heart, a heat behind the eyes. A scorpion found him at dusk, needles sliding into the soft skin between thumb and forefinger as he reached under a rock for a pot. The pain was white, immediate, like stepping into an electric fence. He jerked his hand back and crushed the creature with a reflex that felt older than language, then set about not dying. He bathed the sting in water he could not spare, lashed his hand above the wrist to slow the spread, lay on the cool rock with his arm raised, and counted breaths aloud to stay anchored while the venom sang through his veins. His fingers swelled, his elbow throbbed, and sleep came in ragged slices. By dawn, the pain had receded to a dull drumbeat. He cut his lash and flexed each finger, laughed in relief, then cried because the laugh sounded like someone else's. He wrote, "I am still renting this body, but the landlord is the desert. Pay on time." There were days when the loneliness had edges. He began to speak to the cliff, to the palm by the pool, to the stone he kept on a flat ledge near his sleeping mat. He named it Beacon because it was white, flecked with mica, and flashed when the sun hit it at an angle, and because to give a thing a name is to admit it matters. In the terrible bright hours, he would sit with his back in the narrow sliver of shade and tell Beacon stories about the canal boats of his childhood, about the oil and metal smell of his father's garage on a Saturday afternoon, about how his daughter used to fall asleep mid-sentence, a smile still forming. The telling took the sharpness off the hours. That is all he asked. Once, only once, he decided to leave. A string of signs pulled him: camel prints, fresh dung, a broken gourd still wet at the mouth. Nomads had passed. He packed light, poured the brackish water from his reservoir into 2 skin bladders he'd stitched, left a note for himself in the shelter. "If you are reading this, you made it back," and followed the track into the open. 2 days out, he found a charred fire circle and 3 impressions in the sand where men had slept side by side. He stood in that ring and felt the nearness of conversation like heat. Day 3, the wind shifted, the prince died, and the desert returned to featureless. By the dawn of day 4, his reserves were a fraction and the horizon was a blade. He turned back, not because hope had dimmed, but because he'd learned to spend it carefully. When he saw the palm crowns of his oasis lift into view like a green breath, he felt something that might have been love. He walked straight into the pool, squatted, and let the warm water take him to the wrists, then the elbows, then the shoulders. Back, he wrote that night. Home, he crossed out, then wrote again. Smaller, home. He became a builder of signals. He laid stones in the hardpan beyond the palms in letters tall as a truck tire. SOS, and water, and man. He found the rusted belly of a drum, half buried, and cut it into 2 plates, polishing both with sand and a smear of fat from a lizard tail, until they caught the noon like mirrors. He mounted one on a stick, wedged in a crevice, so it could swing and flash in a wind. He braided a flag from strips of his old shirt and a palm rib, and planted it on the highest fin of rock over the camp. He rehearsed, rescue the way soldiers drill a breach, pack the papers, cinch the sandal straps, douse the coals, grab the journal, grab the knife, grab the tin plate, climb to the shelf, signal with the mirror, wait. He practiced until his muscles moved without asking permission from fear. The seasons tilted and tilted again. A thin green haze filmed the water for a month and then was gone. A night of lightning stitched the far sky and never touched ground. The calendar on the cliff grew to 3 columns, then 4. He marked a year with a circle and the word stay. He said it aloud and heard the desert say nothing back. Nights brought a different quiet than the day's cool. Layered, a quiet with stars in it. He began to know the sky by its arrangement of brightness. The bow of Orion in winter, the scorpion in summer, the long river of the Milky Way that made him feel both microscopic and essential. He would lie on the stone, stomach full of 3 locusts and 1 roasted egg, and tell himself a story in which a man survives because he chooses to be the one who does not stop choosing. When sound came again distant, mechanical, a murmur like a promise, he did not scramble or panic. He stood, took the mirror from its peg, climbed the familiar holds to the shelf, and turned the plate until he caught the sun and threw it in clean, hard pulses toward the streak in the sky. The aircraft slid across the blue and did not change course. He kept signaling until his arm shook. When the noise decayed to nothing, he set the mirror down, sat with his back to the warm rock, and breathed. Then he descended, fed the fire, and wrote, I am seen. Even if they did not see me, I am practicing being found. He slept that night with his hand on the journal, and woke at dawn to the hum, again closer this time, coming from the southwest, not above but across the flats. He rose into the day already moving, climbed already signaling, and when the sun hit his tin, the flash leapt and leapt again. The sound swelled. On the far side of the flats, 3 white trucks nosed into view like sharks. Engineers, he would learn later. Surveyors tracing geology with instruments and curiosity. Men who, in the middle of a continent, had looked up at a cliff and seen a square of light answer them back. He did not wave wildly. He lifted both arms slowly, palms open, the universal, ancient sign that says, I am not a threat, I am only a person. The truck slowed. The first man to step out shaded his eyes, staring at the figure on the rocks as if a mirage had chosen to be kind. John said one word that contained his entire year, the whole ledger of nights and cuts and rebuilds. Water, he said, and then, unbidden, a second word. Please. They gave him water with a caution that told him they knew the desert as more than a postcard, a half cup, then wait, watching for the gut to rebel, then a second, then a third. The first mouthful tasted like the inside of a cloud. He felt it run cool along a throat that had long since forgotten such mercy, and he had to shut his eyes against the shock of it. The men spoke rapid French and Arabic among themselves, and patient, careful English to him. He caught the words, Are you alone? How long? Where is your camp? He pointed to the shelf, where his flag hung limp in the still air, and he guided them up the easiest path, using his hands, like he was showing guests into a house he had built, nail by nail. They moved through the doorway of woven fronds and looked, and because they were human, they performed the inventory out loud. A still, 2 bowls, a knife, this calendar, Jesus, this calendar. One of them touched the notches on the cliff with the back of his fingers as if they might be hot, counting, trying to make arithmetic hold what his eyes were telling him. When they reached the circled mark that had once been a year and traced forward to the column that followed, the man's hand stopped and stayed there. Combien? He asked softly. John said it the way he'd said numbers to himself all this time. Slow, precise, as if precision might grant him belonging. 522, he said, and the man's throat moved. 522. The team had 2 radios and a plan. They used both. Within an hour, a fourth truck arrived, followed by a Land Cruiser with a soft-spoken nurse and a kit that looked to John like the contents of an entire hospital compressed to a backpack. Blood pressure, pulse, capillary refill, pupils. The nurse murmured the language of triage as if praying. She showed him the foil packet of electrolytes, asked permission with her eyes, stirred it into a measured cup, and passed it to him with both hands. He sipped and felt energy like the memory of music return to his limbs. They gave him bread the size of his palm, heavy and warm, and told him to chew slowly. He counted each bite as if it were currency. Packing took minutes, not because there was much, but because each item had been chosen once already, against a cruelty that did not allow second choices. He tucked the journal under his shirt, cinched it with the belt, and for the first time in more than a year, he stood and let someone else shoulder his world. He hesitated at the threshold of the shelter, palm on the fronds, and felt a pang so clear it surprised him. He had hated this place, and he loved it, and both were true. He whispered, "Thank you," not sure if he meant it for the rock or for the stubborn piece of himself that had learned how to be here. Then he followed the living out into the light. The drive to Tamanrasset was a lesson in scale. The desert that had been his entire universe unspooled into a panorama that suddenly contained roads, tire tracks, signposts, the pastel rectangles of houses. At the town's edge, everything multiplied: voices, color, choice. A clinic gave way to a hospital. Fluorescence hummed. A woman in green scrubs washed his arm with something that smelled like mint and clean rain. A doctor with kind eyes said, "You did something impossible," and John looked away because he did not know where to put the sentence. They weighed him, and the number appalled even the staff who had trained to be unshockable. In the days that followed, he ate methodically, as instructed, because too much too soon can break a body as surely as too little for too long. He swallowed antibiotics to outpace the infections that had been closing in with quiet patience. He dozed and woke in a bed that did not grind grit into his skin. When he cried, he did it quietly, from a place deeper than words. Reporters came, because the world still loves to see a man step out of the mouth of death. There were microphones and flashes, and a river of questions. What did you eat? How did you sleep? Were you afraid? Did you ever give up? Each one, a pebble thrown into a lake that had only just stopped freezing at the edges. He answered what he could, which was less than they wanted, and more than he expected. He said, "I kept choosing." He said, "I had a calendar and a job list and a photograph of my daughter, and I did not permit myself to leave those things unfinished." He said, "The desert is indifferent, and that is worse than cruel because there is nothing to argue with. You must become your own reason." Going home was another kind of survival. Plane cabins were surreal, pressurized air, attendants moving like dancers, trays of food that were both abundance and obstacle. In Heathrow, voices layered and layered, until the floor seemed to tilt, and the air felt thin with oxygen. He stood at the top of the arrivals hall, and the crowd opened like surf. And then there was his daughter. Not a photograph, not a page in a journal, but a person with eyes that shone wet and bright. He folded to her, and she to him, and the airport diminished to a room with two people in it breathing the same air. Later, at a small kitchen table that smelled like coffee and clean soap, he touched ordinary objects: a spoon, a light switch, the cool side of a ceramic mug, and felt something like grief for the man who had not always been able to taste the miracle in them. He learned that rescue has three parts: being found, being carried, being returned. The first had been a mirror and a glint. The second, a convoy and a clinic. The third was slow work that unfolded over months. There were nights when he woke with the wind in his ears, heart sprinting, tongue thick and dry, as if the hospital had been the dream and the rock shelf the real. He kept water by the bed, and learned to drink without apology. Crowds exhausted him. Supermarkets made him sweat. He walked with a limp for a while, because the ligaments in his right ankle had torn and scarred in ways only a desert knows how to teach. He sat in a therapist's office and said things out loud that he had only ever carved into stone. I am afraid to waste food. I am afraid of forgetting the exact feel of the sun on that rock. I am afraid the world will seem trivial now, and I will become a man who sneers at small troubles. The therapist told him, fear is a map, not a sentence. And he wrote that down because it sounded like a thing a desert would respect. He returned to the hospital twice for checkups and watched numbers rise. Weight, red blood cell count, a measure of some enzyme that meant his liver had begun to forgive him. He walked farther each week, first to the corner, then to the park, then along the canal where narrowboats bumped the quay and children waved to strangers because the water made them brave. He found a bench at the same curve at the canal and sat there often, closing his eyes against the soft English sun and listening to a distant hum of traffic that, if he laid memory over reality just so, could feel like trucks on the far flats coming to find him again. He did not mind this. Rescue had to be practiced too. People asked him, in private and in letters, what the lesson was, the distilled essence, the part you could carry on a keychain or stitch onto a flag. He could not make the experience small enough for that without lying, and he refused to lie, even to make others comfortable. But when pressed, he said something that was true for him, if not for everyone. Suffering is a poor teacher, he'd say, but attention is a great one. He had paid attention with his life to the direction of the wind, to the angle of the sun, to the way the body will tell you a kind of truth if you learn its language. He had paid attention to love, too, to the way writing a letter to a person every day can be an act of survival, even if you cannot send it. He began sending them now. Not every day. Enough. He met, eventually, with the men who had seen the flash and driven toward it. They ate at a table in a cafe near a quarry, because the men were working a survey up north, and it felt apt to all of them to sit in a place where rock had been read and moved. They showed him a photograph one of them had taken that day, his flag like a small tongue of cloth, his shelter a darker line against the cliff, and in the center a human shape too thin to be a shape at all. He asked them to send the photo and pinned it on the wall above his desk. Not as a trophy, as an altar. He kept the mirror, too, wrapped in cloth in a drawer, not to use, but to know it was there. That which saved you is part of you, he wrote below the photo in pencil. On the anniversary of the day he stepped into the trucks, he woke before dawn because old rhythm is stubborn. The house was quiet. He made tea and took it into the small garden. A fox had passed in the night. There were prints at the edge of the lawn, small, quick hieroglyphs. He stood there and said aloud the number, as he had once said it to men in a white truck in a sea of sand. 522, he said. He did not ask why it had been that long, or why at all. The desert had taught him not to ask questions aimed at silence. Instead, he took a breath that filled him all the way to the edges, raised the mug, and let the steam touch his face. A cloud slid across the early light and moved on. When people tell his story now, they emphasize the feat, the record, the extraordinary nature of it. He understands why. But when he tells it, he tries to emphasize the ordinary, because that is where the miracle actually lived. One more knot tied, one more notch carved, one more sip taken slowly, one more decision to stay upright a few minutes longer than fear preferred. He says, I did not beat the Sahara. He says, I learned to be a person there. And when he is alone, he sometimes takes the journal from the drawer and reads just a random page. A day where nothing much happened. No scorpions, no storms, no planes, only a man writing, I will keep choosing. He closes the book and finds that in this, at least, the desert still offers a lesson generous enough to bring back into the world.